Joy Schmidt. I work with the Alzheimer's and Dementia Alliance of Wisconsin. We're going to have to compete with the kitchen a little bit, but that's all right. Here today to talk about brain health. So you all remembered to get here today, right? So your brain must be working a little bit. So that's good. We're going to talk about some things that we can do to keep our brain resilient and strong. They've learned through research that there's a lot we can do to promote and to build up our resiliency and actually ward off diseases such as dementia and Alzheimer's. So we'll talk about that a little bit. How are the brain teasers coming for those of you who've been working on those? Getting any of the answers? They're hard. Does anyone, have you been able to get through a few of them? Good. How many of you do brain teasers and brain challenges on a regular basis? Like crossword puzzles or this type of thing? Yeah, good. Puzzles in general? Okay, good. So we'll talk about some of the things, some of the other things like that we can do to use our brain and to exercise our brain to build up its strength, basically. All right, let's see. Okay. As I mentioned, I work with the Alzheimer's and Dementia Alliance of Wisconsin. We are the local agency. We are the grassroots agency that's right here in Wisconsin. We are not part of the Alzheimer's Association. That's a lot of people know what the Alzheimer's Association is, and we are not affiliated with them. All of our support happens right here in Wisconsin, and none of our resources go out of Wisconsin. So we are located in the Hilldale area, and we provide support all over Dane County. So Verona is included in that. Our website is www.alzwisc.org, and you can get more information about some of the things I'm going to talk about today, about brain health and Alzheimer's disease, warning signs, medications, current research. All of that information is out on our website, so it's a really good resource. We also have an email, a support at alzwisc.org. This is an area where you can write in questions to us, and we have people who will respond right here in the office. When you call our office, you get to talk to a real person. We don't have computers answering the phone. And you get to talk to someone who lives right here in the Madison area, and someone who knows the resources, and someone who's trained and has a lot of experience, and is most likely a social worker or someone with a counseling background. So when you call us, that's who you get, and we provide a lot of support and education. We also reach out in some of the outlying areas, such as Grant and Richland Center, Sauk County, Columbia County, and Lancaster and Portage, the towns of those. So, all right, so moving on into the program, today we're going to talk about your brain. And I'm going to kind of just explain a little bit about how it works, what's happening in our brain when we think or remember, try to remember information. We're going to discuss your body, the connection between your heart and your brain, the health risks that increase your likelihood of developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease, nutrition, the importance of nutrition on overall brain health, and exercise, how exercise can boost and improve brain function. We're also going to talk about your social connections and stress and depression, and how stress and depression can affect the functioning of your brain, your overall brain health. So as we go through, feel free to stop me and ask questions. If I move too quickly, if I talk about things that don't make sense, feel free to stop me and ask a question as need be. All right, so this is a picture of your brain as if it was sliced in half. So this is kind of what our brain looks like if they sliced it in half. A couple of the areas, let me see. I'll use my fancy little laser pointer. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. So this area right here is called our brain stem, and that part of the brain controls our breathing and our heart rate and our sleep. So that part of the brain keeps us alive. This part right back here is called the cerebellum, and that controls our coordination and our ability to walk. Up here, the cerebral cortex has a couple of areas. The frontal lobe is where our personality is located. That's where our personality is formed. It's also where we control executive function. It's the conductor of our brain. So that's the front portion. That's how we, that portion of the brain works when we're trying to plan what we're going to do today, what we're going to plan to do in the future, is the frontal lobe. And again, your personality is formed there, is controlled in that area. And then another part that I like to point out is this purple kind of backwards shaped C. That's called the hippocampus. And that part of the brain is really vital. All parts of the brain are vital to function, but that part is where we store short-term memory. And that's where we write down new information. So again, it's called the hippocampus. And as you sit out there today, you're learning, you're processing this information. Your hippocampus is working as we sit here, as we try to learn this information. We actually have two of them. So they're actually hippocampi. There's two in the brain, but this is one half of the brain. And then another part I like to point out is this little kind of almond-shaped little red area. That is called the amygdala. And that's the part of our brain that controls our fight or flight response. So when we're afraid, the amygdala is basically sending a message to the parts of our body that need to respond when we're afraid, when we need to flee, when we need to run, or when we need to fight. So what part of the body do we need to use when we need to run away? What parts need more oxygen? Legs, muscles, right? What else needs more energy? Air, oxygen, yeah. So our lungs. So the amygdala basically sends an impulse, it sends a message to our muscles, it sends a message to our heart to increase the blood flow to our muscles and increase the oxygen to our lungs so we can get away. The reason I spend a little time on this is the fact that the amygdala is in effect when we have chronic stress, when we have chronic stress in our life. That's fear. We don't think of it as fear, but it is, and our body reacts to it in the same way as if we are afraid. Chronic stress does the same thing to us. So one interesting part about the amygdala is it's very close to the hippocampus. And when we are afraid, we need our muscles, we need our lungs, but we don't need our short-term memory. We don't need to focus on the flowers around us or what's happening immediately around us. All of our energy is going into our muscles and our oxygen, our lungs. So stress does affect short-term memory. There's actual chemical changes in the brain when we have chronic stress. So ongoing stress does affect short-term memory. It does affect the brain long-term, and it actually shrinks the hippocampus. So stress is a big thing that we need to all deal with. And, you know, none of us have stress, though, do we? And it just gets easier as we get older, right? We have less stress? Not really, right? We have more health issues. We've lost more family. We have more family to worry about. We've seen more things. So there's just more to worry about. But we need to think about stress when we deal with life and find ways to reduce it, because it is going to affect our brain.
Does that affect your eyesight too?
Stress, I don't think so, but I've not read anything about that. So, all right, so this, in our brain, we have 100 billion nerve cells. The cells, what, is that all? Yeah. Somebody asked me, who counted all those, right? 100 billion. I love it when they give these numbers. It's like, how did they figure that out? But we have 100 billion of these. This is a picture of a brain cell, a neuron. And every time we think or do anything, these neurons are working together. The neurons actually never bump into each other. The only way we can communicate between the cells is through these connections here. So these branch-like things, those are called dendrites. And every time we think or want to do anything, we are sending information back and forth between these connections. There's electrical chemical impulses that happen when we think, when we do anything, and they call those synapses. So these little lights here represent the synapses. How many of you have heard that term, my synapses are firing? So that's what it's, when we're able to come up with information that we need, when we're able to do, calculate things in our heads, the synapses are working to allow us to do that. The more of these connections that we have, the stronger our brain is, the more resilient it will be, and we'll talk about that going forward. So back in 1998, that's not that far ago. Does anyone remember 1998? It was a big year in my life. My son was born, so I always remember that year. Not that long ago, they discovered that we can actually form new brain cells. They call this neurogenesis. So they used to think that when we were kids, we formed all the brain cells we were going to get. They didn't really have an age when we stopped, but they didn't realize that no matter how old we get, we can continue to form new brain cells. Isn't that cool? Did you think you were still forming new brain cells? You didn't realize that. You are right now. So the brains, the new brain cells, the neurons, can be formed throughout life, no matter how old we get. So even folks who are over 100, it is still possible to form new brain cells. Even folks who have Alzheimer's disease, even though they're losing brain cells, they've found that they can form new brain cells as well in parts of the brain that aren't damaged yet. The other thing that they've learned over time is that our brains are malleable. They have what they call neuroplasticity. And what that means is that our brain never stops changing through learning. And it can reorganize itself by forming new connections. So you remember those branches that I was just talking about, those dendrites? By forming new dendrites, new connections, increasing the number of synapses, we can reorganize our brain. Does anyone know someone who's had a stroke? Yeah, your husband. What did he do after the stroke? Did he go to the hospital and go for?
Well, he was hospitalized 3 months. He lived 5 years after the stroke, paralyzed on the left side. But he read, spoke well, watched TV.
Good.
He was good in his head.
Good. Now, did he have a period of time where he did therapy, like physical therapy and occupational therapy?
Well, not after the hospital.
Not, okay.
Except at home.
At home, okay. So most people after a stroke go through some kind of therapy, physical, occupational, speech therapy. And what they're actually using is the fact that our brain is malleable and the fact that it's can compensate, basically. So the parts of the brain that haven't been damaged can actually compensate for the parts that have. so people who have trouble walking can learn how to walk again. So pretty fascinating and amazing that our brain can do that. Any questions about the brain, about that information? So here's another picture again of the neuron. The goal is to increase those connections, increase the number of dendrites. When you are doing that, when you are learning new information and improving those connections, you're building up the strength of your brain. Dr. Paul Nussbaum is an author who writes a lot about brain health. So if you're interested in learning more about this, I think his book is called Save Your Brain. He talks a lot about things that we can do to promote brain health. And he refers to Alzheimer's disease as the weed whacker. So picture a weed whacker coming in, and this is a part of your brain. The weed whacker comes in, the cells are dying, because that's what Alzheimer's does. It forms these plaques and tangles that actually choke off the neurons. So if the weed whacker of Alzheimer's is coming in, it's wiping out these connections. But the more of these connections that you have, and the more like a jungle in your brain that you have, the stronger you're going to be, and the longer you're going to delay the onset of the symptoms of Alzheimer's. Does that make sense? Sort of, yeah.
What was that author's name again?
His name is Dr. Paul Nussbaum, Dr. Paul Nussbaum, Nussbaum. And so, to develop more of these connections, we have to think critically, we have to expose ourselves to more information, to new information. We need to think outside the box and think about things differently, because when we do that, we're actually building up our resiliency. And if we have basically a jungle in our brain, if that weed whacker comes in and takes out part of it, other parts of our brain will be able to compensate.
Good question.
Yes?
Is dementia on the same order as this? I don't know what the difference is in dementia.
Dementia and Alzheimer's? That's a good question, because every program I do, someone has a question about that, so I'm glad you asked early. Alzheimer's disease is a diagnosis, and it has the plaques and the tangles. Dementia is a group of symptoms, so it's not actually a diagnosis. So when you go to your doctor and you say, I have memory issues, or my husband has memory issues, his word finding, he's having trouble finding words, he's having trouble doing familiar tasks. Those are the set of symptoms, but they're not a diagnosis. So the diagnosis would be Alzheimer's, maybe Parkinson's with dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies. There's a number of diagnoses that cause the symptoms of dementia. Does that make sense? Not really? So there isn't really, when people say, is there a difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? Well, yes, Alzheimer's is the disease, and it affects a part of the brain differently than other types of other diseases that cause dementia. And I do another presentation, and I can come back and kind of more specifically talk about the disease process itself, or we can talk afterwards. So, all right. So it is normal as we get older to have some changes in our thinking and our memory. Our ability to learn and process information does take more time, and that's normal. As we get older, sometimes we start worrying that, I'm not thinking as clearly as I used to. Is there an issue? It's taking me longer to learn new information. It's taking longer to recall information, and I'm having more difficulty multitasking. All of those things are normal to have some change as we get older. If it starts affecting and impacting your daily life, that's when it's time to talk to a doctor and find out if there is something going on, or if it's something that can be reversed. All right. How many of you know folks in their 80s, 90s, and 100s who are still sharp as a tack? I bet there's a few in here, right? Yeah. So what are some of the things that they're doing, do you think, that are different from the general population who, you know, maybe aren't as sharp as they get older? What are some examples?
I have a sister-in-law who's 94, and she lives alone, and she does a lot of things.
Mhm. So she's still independent, she's
She
doing
is.
things for herself.
They would run the home for her, and she decided she would rather stay there, so she has.
She is, and she's doing okay. Good. So she's staying busy. What are some other things that,
You know, I think some of these people are the ones that I know that are really sharp. They had a healthy early life.
Early
You know,
life.
They stayed physically fit, they eat well,
Mhm.
and I think that's the fact.
sure, yeah, definitely.
You know, they're brain healthy.
So they took care of themselves all throughout their life. They didn't just
Right.
wait until they were 65 and decide, oh, I need to get
Like me,
into.
it's time to lose weight instead of
Right.
increase the blood pressure, you know.
Right, exactly. But
So-
with that being said, it's never too late to start.
Right.
You know, even if we haven't done the right things early, it's never too late to start.
Is this an inherited thing to a degree?
Alzheimer's disease, if you have it in your family, there is a higher risk. As I mentioned, there are a number of diseases that cause dementia. It depends on the disease, whether those are genetic. Some are, some aren't. But Alzheimer's disease, there is an increased chance if you have it in your family. So for those folks, it's just important to stay on top of it, to be aware, you know, to watch for changes, to make sure you get an assessment, get a baseline, find out where you are today so you know going forward if there are changes. It's important to get an early diagnosis because there are things they can do, medications or other treatments or strategies. Planning is important. And then sometimes there are things that look like Alzheimer's but they really aren't. So they're actually reversible. You can have an infection that causes what looks like symptoms of Alzheimer's. Did you have a question?
Yeah, does diabetes cause?
There's a higher risk to having dementia if you have diabetes, yeah. But, you know, again, all of these things, we just have to focus on the positive. Take your medication. There's an increased risk, but by eating right, taking your medication, keeping your numbers in line, and we'll talk more about that. So by doing mental activity, we actually are increasing the blood flow to our brain, increasing the oxygen, and improving our overall mental brain health. We're forming new connections when we do these things. When we use our brain, we're actually improving the strength and improving the connections. And by thinking critically, so have you heard that term, think critically? They use it with kids these days. It's problem solving. You're faced with a problem, how do you solve that? It's, sometimes like a word problem. If we think critically, we are actually helping that front portion of our brain where the executive function is found. And so we're improving the strength of that area. So just to do a quick brain teaser here, this is an example of a brain teaser. This is a common phrase. Can anyone get what this common phrase is? Very good. Have you seen that one before, or you're just that good? Was that you? Oh, that was you. Have you seen that one before, or you're just like that? Do you do a lot of these?
No, but I do crossword. I do a lot of
Crosswords, okay, good. Forgive and forget. All right. Here's another one. How many squares do you see?
I counted 23 on
On your sheet? Okay. You're closer, but it's still up from there. You got 16 here, but think outside the box. You can think. 23.
That's about that, yeah.
Okay. And there's a few that are harder to find. It took me a while to find all of these. I only started this. Yeah, 26. I started this job back in January, and I did a few of these presentations, and someone asked me, well, you know, I gave them the answer. The answer is actually 30. And someone asked me, how did you find those? And I hadn't found them yet. I said it was on the answer sheet. So finally I sat down and actually I had a math teacher in one of my programs who told me where they all were. But the ones that are easy to miss are these big ones here. So there are 4, you see where I'm going here? So that's one. So it's basically not letting the line stop you. It's, you know, counting the 3 across here. So there's a 30 in total. So when you take that home, make sure, you know, look and see if you can find all of those squares. So I always like to ask at this point in the program, how do you feel after you did that puzzle, after we used our brain a little bit?
Feel good.
You feel good.
You feel smart.
You feel smart, good. You feel a little bit more alert.
Like a crossword puzzle.
Yeah, do you feel a little bit more awake? You know, it's after lunch, we're all kind of dragging. But after we do a puzzle, we feel maybe a little bit more awake. What's happening is you're actually increasing the blood flow just by thinking. Just by trying to solve a puzzle, you're using your brain. Whereas if you just sit and listen to someone lecture, sure, your brain is working a little bit, but it's easy after maybe 10 minutes or so, I lose you. And so it's better to actively use your brain by doing things like this to build up the blood flow, increase the oxygen. And you're actually improving your brain by doing that. All right. So what are some things that you do? We've talked about crossword puzzles. Are there any other things that you do to exercise your brain?
Word search.
Word search.
Millionaire on TV.
Sudoku. Millionaire.
Question and answer programs.
Good.
Cryptoquote.
What's that?
Cryptoquote.
Cryptoquote. Good.
I do a lot of things on the computer, but I don't know if it's really doing a lot for my brain. I often wonder, you know.
Is it like trivia or?
No, it's more like, well, solitaire, that's what I started on, and now I
Mhm.
branched out. And it's like Candy Crush where you move things around and, you know.
Yeah, I think.
I don't know.
Yeah, so any of the games she plays, Solitaire and Candy Crush and kind of computer games, I think, you know, as long as you're having to use your brain, you're working your brain. So I think the goal, though, is to increase the variety in the things that you do. So mix it up a bit. Try to add in some new exercises.
How about reading?
Reading, yeah. Definitely, definitely. And I'll say this probably too many times, but change it up. Don't just read the same types of things. Read nonfiction some of the time. Try to learn new information. But reading is good, and they found that people who read late into life have a lower risk of developing dementia. So keep reading. Here's some other examples. Take classes. I know they offer a lot of classes here at the Senior Center, so try to take classes. Hobbies, pursue hobbies. Read books, newspapers, magazines, work crossword puzzles, brain teasers, do puzzles. Somebody mentioned that they do those. Crafts or quilting, write letters, garden. They say that our arms and our legs are the pathway to our brain. So if you combine your physical with your mental, you're going to improve the function, and you're going to improve, you know, the learning and improve the exercise of your brain. So role models, some other things. They say even simple things that we do. Again, it's mix it up. Variety is key in everything that we do, from, you know, exercising our body and exercising our brain. So some of the suggestions that I've heard, just even simple things, are, you know, take a different route home. So when you go home today, don't go the normal route. Find a new route, because you're going to be building up. You're having to look at signs. You're having to use your brain in a different way. I've even heard something as simple as using your left hand when you brush your teeth, if you normally use your right hand. So
Just go through roundabouts.
go through roundabouts. See, I think they were thinking about us when they built those roundabouts, because they were trying to help our brain health. I'm sure that's it.
I go look for every route that I can miss a roundabout.
Well, then I guess you're building it that way because you're discovering new places. So it's important to change it up. How many of you, for those who eat here for lunch, you always sit at the same spot?
They have you set up.
They have them set up. Is it different every time? Or is it always the same?
Pretty much.
Pretty much the same. If it's possible, I'd encourage them to switch it up, because it's going to help your brain health to sit somewhere different, get a different perspective, and talk to someone new.
It gives them more work to do than if they're going to do it different.
Oh, okay.
They set up a pattern and put it
Oh, okay, all right.
For them.
For them. So, but try to switch up your routine, yes?
You notice that in church, everybody sits in the same.
They do, I know. But my suggestion would be to change that, or suggest a change in that, because, and you can always say, my kids are so sick of me saying, it's good for your brain health. But, all of these things, you can say to them at church that it's good for our brain health, let's switch it up. Because not only are you sitting in a different location, so it's something new, but you're also talking to new people. So even just visiting with other people, meeting new people, you're using your brain a bit more than if you visit with the people you always talk to. Okay. So the brain can be shaped by positive environmental information. We have some tips, steps to improve your memory. When we're having difficulty with memory, there are three basic areas of our memory that are involved. We have to acquire the information, we have to store the information, and then retrieve the information. So if we're having trouble with our memory, we're having trouble with one or more of these areas. Step one, getting the information in. We have to focus on it. We have to pay attention to it if we want to acquire that information. We have to reduce the other stimulation going on to get that information acquired. To store the information, again, paying attention to it. Different types of memory get stored in different parts of the brain. So we have a part of our brain where language is stored, and a part where math and facts are stored. So depending on if we're having issues, a part of the brain that stores that information could be affected if we're struggling. And then the third step is retrieve the information. So recognition or recall. Recognition is easier. That's like multiple choice tests, right? If we're given the answers, a set of 3 answers, it's easier for us to remember that information than if we have to just pull it out of our brain from nothing. So recall is more difficult. Some tips to improve your memory are to repeat it out loud. So if you are trying to remember this information, like what does the hippocampus do? Does anyone remember?
Storage.
Pardon?
It's a storage of brain. That's
Storage. Storage is close though. Stores what?
Memory.
Short-term memory. Memory, yeah. So when we learn that word, hippocampus, everybody say that out loud. Okay. Let's say it 2 more times.
Hippocampus.
Hippocampus, okay.
Please spell it.
Hippocampus. So saying it over and over helps us remember the information. Part of the reason is we are making some connections in our brain. We are using a couple of different parts of our brain to remember that information. So we're using the auditory, because we heard ourselves say it out loud. And then we're using possibly the visual. We're connecting between hearing it and saying it. So it's going to make a better connection in our brain, and we'll be able to remember it better. repeat it out loud, tell someone else if we teach the information. So if you go back after today and you tell your daughter or your husband what you learned about today, you're going to remember that information better. You're going to store that information. So if you use it right away, how many of you have cell phones? Were they difficult to use the first time? Yeah. So if somebody showed you how to use it and then you put it away for a week and you pulled it out again, would you be able to use it, do you think? No. So we need to use that information right away for that to stick. Again, it's using other parts of our brain to help make that connection. Writing it down. I see some of you take notes by writing it. We're using another part of our brain, and it's going to help that stick because we're going to see what we wrote, and then we have the, our hand, the motor function happening, so that's going to increase our ability to remember it. Focus. We have so much information coming into us that sometimes we don't focus. There's, and then we're not going to remember. Associate it with something else. Another way to remember hippocampus is think of a hippo on campus, right? And think of him learning new information. So it's kind of that word association. The hippocampus, he's learning and he's using his short-term memory. Yes?
I would just like to make a comment. Someone told me when you park your car, sometimes you forget where you park your car if you're gone for an hour or 2 hours.
Right.
So when you park your car and you actually walk away, you should turn around and look where you parked, because it'll help you remember when you come back.
Right, that's a good one. Did everyone hear her? Okay. So yeah, I think that's great because you're
It looks
using your
different.
visual. Right.
It looks different
Right.
when you come back.
And yeah, so many times we do that. We walk into the store and it's not that we've forgotten, we just didn't pay attention to where we left the car. So that's a good suggestion. Sometimes going through the alphabet if you're looking for a word or a name. Preparing ahead. So if you're going to a party, kind of plan ahead who's going to be there and the names that you need to remember. And use memory aids. How many of you use the pill boxes for the week? You have all your pills set up. Yeah, I do too. So, because I can't remember, did I take those today or not? So,
I have a question.
yes.
I'm sure I'm not alone if I go downstairs to get something out of the freezer, I forget what I'm down there for. If I said it out loud before I went, would that?
That probably would help. And if you said it out loud 3 times, that would probably help. So, and some of it is just, we think about it once, yeah, and then we go and then we forget what happened. I know. And then we have to go all the way back, right? Yeah, Bill Cosby used to have a joke about this. He said that if you're in the kitchen or in the living room and you need to go into the kitchen and you get there and you can't remember, what you have to do is go back to where you started. And he said our memory was stored in a different place. He said you just hit yourself on the butt and that sends it back to your brain. Because it fell, I guess, down. So that was Bill Cosby. But it's just the act of going back. Then it's like, of course, I remember. But yeah, maybe saying it out loud would help. And it's putting your attention on it. We're all so busy keeping track of everything, so it's putting your attention on it. So the connection between the heart and the brain, there is a big connection there. Every time our heart beats, 25% of our blood goes to our brain. The brain is the biggest user of oxygen. So we need anything we can do to keep our heart healthy is also going to keep our brain healthy. There was a study done, it's actually an ongoing study, where they're looking at nuns. About 700 nuns in Notre Dame have agreed to participate in this study. And they're looking at Alzheimer's disease. They've agreed their lives are very similar. They've eaten the same things. They've had kind of the same lifestyle. So they're a really good group of people to study. And what they have found is that those nuns who showed symptoms of Alzheimer's disease also had damage to their blood vessels. So they actually found on autopsy some of the nuns who had Alzheimer's in their brain once they did the autopsy, but they didn't show symptoms. They didn't have any damage to their blood vessels. So if we can keep our blood vessels healthy, do the things we need to do to keep our heart healthy, we have lower risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. Some of the other health risks that we need to consider, it's important to monitor your numbers, both for all of these things, blood pressure, cholesterol, and weight. Folks, there was a study in Sweden that showed that middle-aged people who were obese were twice as likely to develop dementia. And those who had high cholesterol and were obese had a 6 times higher risk of developing dementia. So try to focus on those things, and it's never too late. I know it's easy to get frustrated sometimes. You know, we think we've done all the right things. Some of these things are genetic, so we're born with high cholesterol, it seems like. But do what you can to keep those numbers, and taking medication to deal with blood pressure. They're finding that that makes a significant difference in developing, decreasing the number of folks with dementia. All right. Some other things to be aware of is medications. We need to make sure that there aren't any adverse reactions happening between, taking medications. As we get older, we take more and more, it seems like, so make sure they're not interacting in bad ways. And also, as we age, sometimes we don't metabolize our medicines as well. So I've listened to a doctor recently who said that he was working with someone who had been on a medication for 20 years, and she didn't think that was the problem, or her family didn't think that was the problem, but she was showing signs of dementia. And he took her off that medication, and she was fine again. She was, completely fine. No memory issues, nothing. So make sure, if you're concerned about yourself or someone else, that you talk to somebody who, kind of specializes in this area. Avoid head trauma. There is an increased risk for those who have head trauma. So if they've had head trauma earlier in life with loss of consciousness, there is an increased risk for dementia. And then sleep. It's important to get enough good sleep, because there is some link to sleep issues and dementia. Okay. Any questions before I move on to nutrition?
Is it wise to go to the library and get a book about learning memory? I came across one, Memory Power.
Memory power?
Yeah, and it was large print.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I did finish reading it.
Okay. She
Did that
asked,
help?
was it like games and activities that you could do for your memory?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say anything like that is very beneficial. Yeah, there's a lot of information out there. I guess I would only caution that if it costs a lot of money, you don't need to do that. There's a lot of people wanting to prey on the fact that we're all worried about our memory and worried about Alzheimer's disease. But going to the library is perfect. AARP, they have a website that has good brain teasers and things. But unless you have lots of, excess income, there's no need to buy anything to work and to challenge your brain. But the library is a great place. So they're finding that nutrition a heart-healthy diet is linked to a brain-healthy diet. So they're finding that nutrition, the things we eat, can make a difference. They're doing both, studies with people, kind of surveying what they've eaten over the years, and also animal research. But these are some of the things that are helpful, that they found that help against, delay the onset of issues like dementia. So berries, anything that ends in berry, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, fruits, plums, oranges, and red grapes. These are all high in antioxidants. So we know antioxidants are good for us, right? They're good for our heart, but they're also good for our brain. And the reason is the brain uses a lot of oxygen, and there's oxidative buildup. So these are going to help combat that. What did your grandma and your mom always tell you to eat before you could have dessert? The vegetables, right? So we know those are good for us. And she was right. She was right. So they're good for our heart. They're very good for our brain. So it's important to eat those. Over and over in the news, you hear all these studies that keep coming out. Ginkgo, coconut oil. I mean, there seems like there's a new one every day that says, this is going to help you ward off Alzheimer's disease. I guess I caution all of you. Just be aware, don't assume that they're right because a study has come out and has said that this is going to help you. Sometimes it's a study of 20 people. So be careful. The internet is a great thing, but it's also a really dangerous thing because anybody can pay someone to say what they want to say when they do a research study. So I caution you to be aware. We know fruits and vegetables are good for us. If we stick with those, we're going to be okay. The other thing is anything with omega-3s, so fish, like halibut, mackerel, salmon, trout. The omega-3 actually builds up kind of a shield over our brain, kind of a protective area that kind of protects our brain. So the DHA that's in omega-3s. And then nuts are good as well. So if we think fruits, vegetables, and omega-3s, flaxseed also has omega-3. All right.
Is flaxseed considered a nut? Flaxseed, what is it?
It's a seed. So you can buy it in the seed form.
I've seen it, but I'm wondering, is that
Considered a nut? I don't think so. I think it is just a seed.
Okay.
Flaxseed. Oh, she was asking about flax seed. Is it a nut? But I think it's a seed.
Okay.
Is BA juice good too?
I haven't read, but I would guess. I mean, I think we need to focus on foods that are low in fat, low in sodium. Maybe the low sodium V8 would be better. But I would think that, there's good things in V8. Low sugars. We don't want to have a lot of sugar. There's been studies about all these things. Cholesterol affects the cell division in our brain, so try to eat things that are low in fat. You had a question?
Flax seed, you can also get flax meal.
Right, which is ground up
Yeah.
flaxseed. And there's flaxseed oil, which is also good. But I don't think you're supposed to cook flaxseed oil. I think you can only use it uncooked.
Another thing, Dr. Oz has covered most of these things.
Has he?
So
Okay.
watch him at 4 o'clock.
Watch him. But be careful. I guess, I like some of what Dr. Oz says, but I also
Yeah.
think you need to be careful because he sometimes will take whatever, he's got a show to put on. So just be careful. He would have you eating, so many different things. And variety is good, but be careful. I read something recently about coconut oil. Did he talk
That
about?
was yesterday, yes.
He said that was good, right?
2 tablespoons.
2 tablespoons.
But you can use it for facial too.
Okay, but I also hear some negatives about coconut oil because it can cause, other issues, cholesterol. So that's the kind of thing that I guess I warn you to be careful and to be cautious.
Everyone is something.
Yeah, so that's why I always go back to fruits and vegetables. We know those are good for us, and we know a little bit of protein. We know the omega-3s are good. Yes?
I want about Dr. Oz. There was an advertisement I saw in a magazine, and I got really excited about it. It was how to lose weight, and it's for your brain, and all this kind of thing. And I saw it. I was really excited because my daughter's overweight. She's just struggling with it all of the time. So I went out and found this product, and it was very difficult to find, but I found the product, brought it back to my daughter, and she said, well, what is this all about? And I said, well, this is the advertisement, blah, blah, blah. She looked it up on the internet. He had never said that.
Oh.
It was a paid advertisement, so you have to be careful.
You do. More and more I'm finding, you read something, and if you really do your research, it can be very wrong. So you need to be careful. That's exactly why I say what your grandma told you, your fruits and your vegetables, those are going to be okay. Some of these other things, we may start them today, and then next year they tell us that, oh, these are bad for you. So broccoli has never been on that list of things that's bad for us, right? It's always on the good list. So focus on the things that we've known for years. It's on the good list. All right, so I'll have to speed it up here because we are almost out of time, but exercise is really important for brain health. When we exercise, whether it's walking or biking or swimming or doing anything, we are increasing the blood flow to our brain. So any kind of exercise that you can add into your life is going to help. As we get older, we have arthritis, it gets harder, but there are still things that we can do, just a walk around the block if you can, or the walk around the apartment building, chair exercises. But if you can, get out and ride your bike. Mix it up. Here again, we want to mix it up. We want to mix up our brain exercise. We want to mix up what we eat, and we want to mix up the exercise that we get, because we are working other parts of our brain when we do that. How many of you walk every day, or quite a few times? Yeah. My suggestion is take a different walk. When you walk, do you always walk the same route? No. We're such creatures of habit, aren't we? So switch it up tomorrow. Walk a different way. Just, explore something new. Our perception of time actually changes a little bit as we are, it takes us more time to process new information. So we actually perceive time as being less when we're exposing ourselves to new information.
Now, exercise, do we have to do it every day?
Well, if you can, ideally, yeah. And it doesn't have to be a whole long time, it doesn't have to be an hour, but ideally every day, okay? Take the stairs if you can, if you're able. Park farther from the grocery store. My dream is that someday we will all be fighting for those spots, really far from the store rather than the ones closest to the store. So it's adding in these kind of routine things that we don't even think about, but you're adding in some exercise. It's going to improve your brain health. And actually they've discovered that when we exercise, we actually build more synapses and we improve our function. And this is true even in folks who already have dementia. So they're finding that by bringing in exercise programs to those folks, that we're improving their function through exercise. All right, they've also found that our social connections are important as we get older, especially, that we can reduce our chances of developing dementia by keeping those social connections. Folks who don't have these have an increased risk for developing dementia. They typically develop memory impairment sooner than those who have continued to have social connections. So it's important to stay active. Volunteer. How many of you volunteer? Couple. I know they have lots of volunteer opportunities here, so I'm sure they could put you to work. Volunteer, join clubs, card games, bingo, knitting groups. What are some other examples of things that you do socially? Anyone? Quilt. Quilting groups? Those are good. Book clubs, good.
Go to the theater.
Sports teams? What kind of sports? Golf? Good, good, good. So you're kind of combining a couple of things. Dr. Nussbaum also talks about how that can be really beneficial if you're combining a sport, which you're getting your exercise, and the social connection, along with the exercise and then connecting with other people. Travel if you can, and it doesn't mean Europe. It just means maybe go to Stoughton. So go somewhere different. It doesn't have to be far away. Stoughton's the new destination. But that is you're going to have to process new information when you go somewhere different. How many times, when you go on vacation, it seems like, it lasts so much longer than just our day-to-day routine. You come back from vacation and it seems like a much longer period of time. It's because your brain has been working harder to process that new information. Spend time with family, and also you need to focus on treating your stress and dealing with depression. As we talked about earlier, stress affects our short-term memory. It affects the hippocampus. It actually changes the chemical makeup and shrinks the hippocampus. So we need to deal with our stress. What are some ways that you deal with your stress? Exercise is a good one. Quilt. Good. Anyone else? Yoga?
Meditate.
Meditate. I like that one. Some people pray. Some people meditate. They're doing a lot of studies on stress reduction with both meditation and prayer. So those can be really helpful. And then depression. Treat your depression if you have it. People who have depression later in life do have a higher risk for memory issues later on. So it's either getting out, getting active to kind of combat depression, or taking medications if need be, talking to a therapist if need be. So it's important to treat that. And then also maintaining goals and purpose. There are, in Okinawa, they're looking at Okinawa because there are more 100-year-olds living there than anywhere else in the world. And they're looking at why is that happening? They're healthy 100-year-olds who have no cognitive issues. One of the things that they're looking at is if they continue to be active with kids, they're still involved in their communities, they're still a part of everyday life. They aren't retired in Arizona. They're not pulling away from everything that's happening, that was happening daily in their previous life. So it's important to maintain goals and purpose, whether that's volunteering, whether that's helping your grandkids, whether that's working a little bit, or even looking after your neighbor. I've met people who, they live in these apartment communities, and they make sure that everyone gets their newspaper every morning and make sure that, they're up and going and that everyone's okay. All by itself, that's a sense of purpose. So it's even just helping your neighbor, helping your friends. So all of these things can help us as we build up the resiliency. There's no guarantee. Alzheimer's is a disease. So if we're going to get it, there's no guarantee. But they have found if our brains are more resilient and we have more reserve, that we can actually delay the onset of the symptoms. Okay? Any questions?
How is it diagnosed?
They are much more accurate than they used to be. They're about 90 to 95% accurate these days. But it's done through a number of tests. So both verbal, they'll ask you a bunch of questions. There are memory assessment clinics here in all over Dane County, and we can give you information about those if you're interested. But it's a number of tests. MRIs sometimes are involved, PET scans, CAT scans, but they are a lot better at diagnosing that these days. Any other questions or comments?
If someone in your family has Alzheimer's, did you stand a chance that you might get it yourself?
There
Or
is
do you have to be careful?
There is an increased chance if somebody in your family, especially if they are close. If it's a distant cousin,
No, I'm talking about my mother.
your
my
mom,
father.
yeah, mother and father, then yes, your odds are a bit higher. So you do need to be more aware of changes.
There are tests that you can take.
Yes, there are memory assessment clinics, and it's important to do that, to kind of find out where you are. Some doctors are better trained in this than others.
Yeah.
Sometimes people go into their doctor and they say, I'm worried about my memory, and the doctor says, oh, you're just getting older, it's normal, you know, don't worry, you're fine, because he sees, you know, that you're fine. The person who has the memory issues is frequently, or, you know, most often, the first one to notice. And people who are noticing changes, if your doctor says, oh, don't worry about that, and yet you're still noticing significant changes, you need to push that a little bit further and say, no, I want to be tested. You know, I want to get an assessment, a more full assessment to understand. And we need to do this. We can't bury our heads in the sand because, you know, there are things that can be done. And most people who find out the diagnosis wish they had known sooner. So it is important to get that, to find out.
What things can be done?
There are some medications, there are some strategies, there's some planning that come, you know, planning for your future, talking to family. But some medications can slow down the progression of the disease.
So that's basically about.
That's the main thing. And then the other thing, well, there's some strategies by doing a lot of these things, but really focusing on them to, you know, build up the resiliency of your brain. So we have a couple of sisters in our program who were diagnosed a few years ago, and they both made it their mission to slow down this progression, and they're doing this through exercise, diet, challenging their brains, decreasing their stress. So there are things that they're doing and that can be done. Okay.
Does the Alliance provide any testing?
We don't provide testing. We can suggest places you can go to, though. I'm almost finished up, but part of our mission is to try to find a cure for this disease, or help to find what's causing this, and hopefully delay the onset at least of the symptoms. So we work closely with the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and they have, they're at UW Hospital and the VA, and they're always looking for participants in studies. So if you're interested in helping find a cure, that's something you might consider. And then the other positive is, you know, if you're part of this study, you'll be able to kind of observe if there are any changes in yourself, in your own brain. So that's adrc.wisc.edu, and I have some information if you're interested.
What about the national?
The National Alzheimer's Association?
Right, I've got something.
Are you? Okay. The National Association, we used to be affiliated with them, so we've been around here in Madison since the 80s. We were connected with the association, but they were wanting to pull more money to Washington. They're primarily a lobbying organization, so they're kind of in Washington trying to make changes to laws, whereas we're more providing services, programs for families, programs for the people with the disease. So that's kind of the difference between our organizations. We do have a helpline that's available. We answer calls, as I said, a live person here in Madison who can answer questions. Great website and resource information. And then we offer a lot of education, like we're doing today, but also education to families and the person with the disease to help them understand what's happening in the brain with some of these diseases. So that's kind of, let's see, I guess I have one more slide. These are some things that you can do if you're interested in kind of helping support our mission, helping find a cure. We advocate at the state level, so we have a gentleman who works here in Wisconsin to try to affect laws that affect people with dementia. So that's something we do. We're looking for volunteers, and then we are not federally funded, or we receive no state funds or federal funds. So the only way we can continue is through donations. We do have our Alzheimer's Walk coming up in September, September 28th, so we hope you'll possibly donate or participate in that. So, any other questions in general?